Share an address show. Here's the issue. My problem is not the fact that you fucking clowns got on there Saturday night and said some things about President Mr. Trump that, in my opinion, were in extremely poor taste. However, you are all American citizens, except maybe for Tom. That guy's fucking suspect. That hairy bastard is a fucking Eastern European if I ever did see one. Anyway, you're American citizens. You're entitled to your opinion, however vile it may be. But the problem is that you let a foreigner get on your platform and say some very vile, disgusting things about President Mr. Trump. Now that is unacceptable. That is tantamount to treason. That clown has no say. That clown has no fucking opinion. Nobody over here is saying jack shit about his fucking yuck mouth king or his very masculine looking wife or his soulless ginger cunt fucking son with his fucking dirty half-breed American wife. Nobody's saying nothing about that because nobody gives a fuck. We're Americans. It ain't our goddamn business. So yeah, fuck you, Share an Address show. You guys need to apologize. That's all. Part 4.
First, when I contacted Manson in 1985, I'm a musician, and my primary interest in him was as a musician. And our first contact was pretty much about music and an effort that I made to make a live recording of him performing his music in San Quentin prison, which, as I've recently discussed with another interviewer, was basically that turned into the film Charles Manson Superstar, because the prison authorities wouldn't allow him to use a guitar, saying that it could be used as a weapon. So instead, we did an interview at the last minute, which basically became the core of my 1989 documentary, Charles Manson Superstar. So what you say about culture being important, I think it's extremely crucial to this case and to understanding what this is all about. In fact, it's the essential factor. It is Manson's music. Maybe before I get into the specifics of what you're asking about Topanga Canyon, if I were to ask you, what is the public myth of Charles Manson's connection to music? I think, like most people, the first thing that comes to mind, the myth of Manson as a musician, is that he was a talentless nobody, desperate for attention from the music industry, who was considered to be talentless by everyone he encountered, who was spurned, and who then jealously sought revenge on the music industry that had spurned his talent out of his megalomaniac hatred of society. That's basically the idea that is pushed by the mass media.
Right.
And if you look at most interviews with the aging rock and roll music figures from that time who encountered him, most of them pretty much push that party line, that he was a talentless musician and that, you know, the murders must have some way been motivated by his hatred of the music industry that had spurned him. Well, that's not even remotely true. Now, as far as his talent, that's a subjective matter, whether you like his music or don't like his music. The fact is, and here I think it's important to trace this whole development and see how his music is intrinsically connected to the crimes that occurred later, and vice versa, how really they're all part of one continuum. When he was in prison in Terminal Island in 1960, he, well, a little bit before that, he had encountered, many musicians in prison, and he'd been working on guitar playing in several prison bands. But through creepy Alvin Karpis, who a name may be forgotten these days, but once creepy Alvin Karpis was public enemy number one during the 1930s crime spree. He was a figure in the Ma Barker gang and a legendary figure in United States crime history. He was actually personally arrested by J. Edgar Hoover. Well, Alvin Creepy Karpis was one of the first people who actually saw Manson's talent in prison when he was just an unknown fellow con. He taught him some steel guitar rubs, and Manson has spoken of him as a kind of mentor. Creepy Alvin Karpis, though, was also deeply connected to the underworld and to the mafia, and as most people who know about prison culture know, the underworld and organized crime is very active within prison. So what's important to know about this is that a lot of people may be aware of Karpis being a sort of musical mentor to Manson and teaching him some guitar methods and techniques. But what's more important to the whole case is that Karpis gave some references for Manson, because he was going to be paroled shortly thereafter, to underworld figures who ran nightclubs and who were involved in the music industry. So as happens in prison, there's always a kind of favor given, but there's a favor owed, if you follow what I'm saying. So Karpis gave Manson references to other music people outside so that when he got out, he could look for work. Another underworld figure Manson encountered in prison was Frankie Carbo, who was also a legendary underworld figure at that time, and he was known as Mr. Gray. You couldn't even speak about Frankie Carbo in a phone conversation because the FBI listening in would know who you were talking about. So he was spoken of as Mr. Gray. But he fixed major boxing fights. He was basically the lord of illegal gambling of Las Vegas. He probably fixed the fight that made Muhammad Ali or then Cassius Clay a champion. He was an extremely powerful underworld figure. Manson met him, and he too, through the Karpis connection, also gave references to Manson in the outer world, so that when he got out of prison, he could apply for work at various nightclubs. So that's a very important thing that ties in later to the crimes. Another guy that Manson encountered in prison named Philip Kaufman, who was a drug dealer, which is an important factor to keep in mind because this whole case is all about drug dealing. It's basically what it all comes down to. Phil Kaufman gave references to Manson as well in prison to go to a guy at Universal Studios called Gary Stromberg. And Gary Stromberg, by his own admission, had been sending LSD in letters, in other words, writing letters that were dipped in liquid LSD to the prison so that the prisoners could take acid in prison. And that was one of the ways that Manson got introduced to the world that was outside of drug dealing. He had formerly been a petty thief, a pimp, an auto ring operator, basically a petty thief, though, and a pimp. And it was through Kaufman and other people he encountered that he started to see the new crime industry that was worth getting into was drug dealing. And Haight-Ashbury was happening right outside, as he was getting out of prison. So these are very important.